June 24, 1941. A dusty crossroads outside Raseiniai, Lithuania. The morning sun cast long shadows across the landscape as a German supply convoy rumbled down the road, carrying wounded soldiers and prisoners back from the front lines of Operation Barbarossa. Then the convoy commander saw it, a lone Soviet tank sitting motionless at the intersection ahead, its massive turret pointing down the road like the finger of death. The KV-1 heavy tank looked abandoned, silent, harmless, until it opened fire. The first shell vaporized the lead truck. The convoy scattered in panic, vehicles turning around and fleeing back toward German lines. Behind them, the Soviet tank settled back into silence, blocking the road like a steel fortress that had materialized from the earth itself. What followed was one of the most extraordinary individual stands in military history. For 24 hours, 6 Soviet tankers and a single KV-1 heavy tank held off an entire German mechanized division, stopping the advance of 5,000 enemy soldiers. This was the Battle of Raseiniai, and it would introduce the German Wehrmacht to a terrifying new reality. They were no longer invincible. Operation Barbarossa had begun just 2 days earlier with devastating success. 3 million German soldiers had poured across the Soviet frontier in the largest military operation in human history. Army Group North swept through the Baltic states like an avalanche, crushing Soviet defenses and racing toward Leningrad. The German 6th Panzer Division was spearheading the advance through Lithuania, confident after their lightning victories in Poland and France. Led by General Werner Kempf, their Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks had swept aside every enemy with contemptuous ease. German tank crews considered themselves the masters of armored warfare, expecting the Red Army to collapse within weeks. But on June 23, 1941, near the Lithuanian town of Raseiniai, the Germans encountered something they had never seen before: Soviet KV-1 heavy tanks. The Kliment Voroshilov tank was a monster by 1941 standards. Weighing 47 tons with steel armor up to 90 millimeters thick, it was virtually immune to German anti-tank weapons. The tank's 76.2 millimeter main gun could penetrate any German tank at combat ranges, while its crew of 5 was trained to fight to the death. German anti-tank doctrine was based on experience against inferior Polish and French armor. The Wehrmacht's 37mm guns couldn't penetrate KV-1 armor at any range. Even 50mm POC-38 guns were largely ineffective. German tank crews discovered they could fire repeatedly at a KV-1 without effect, while the Soviet tank could destroy them with a single shot. When the first KV-1s appeared on the battlefield near Raseiniai, German tank crews watched in horror as their armor-piercing shells simply bounced off the Soviet monsters. The KV-1s rolled through German positions like mobile fortresses, crushing anti-tank guns under their tracks and shrugging off direct hits from multiple tanks. German infantry fled in terror as the massive Soviet tanks overran their positions. For the first time since the war began, German soldiers were running from enemy armor. The psychological impact was devastating. But most of the KV-1s were part of larger Soviet formations that were quickly overwhelmed by German air power and superior tactics. The Luftwaffe pounded Soviet tank columns from the air. German forces used their mobility and coordination to isolate individual Soviet tanks and destroy them with concentrated fire. By the evening of June 23, the battle seemed won. The German 6th Panzer Division had captured Raseiniai and established bridgeheads across the Dubica River. Kampfgruppe Raus, commanded by Colonel Erhard Raus, controlled the main supply route between the forward positions and division headquarters. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then one KV-1 tank changed everything. According to local Lithuanian witnesses, the tank arrived at the crossroads on the evening of June 23. It drove to the intersection, stopped, and remained motionless through the night. No one knew why it was there. It might have been separated from its unit during the chaotic retreat. It might have run out of fuel. The crew might have been following orders to hold the position at all costs. What happened next was beyond belief. When the German supply convoy encountered the tank the following morning, the KV-1 opened fire without warning. Trucks exploded, men scattered, and the convoy fled in disorder. The tank had cut the main supply line between Kampfgruppe Raus and the rest of the 6th Panzer Division. Colonel Raus initially assumed this was the beginning of a major Soviet counterattack. He positioned his forces defensively and waited for the assault that never came. Hours passed. Intelligence reports trickled in. German reconnaissance probed the area around the crossroads. Gradually, the impossible truth became clear. It was just one tank. A single KV-1 had positioned itself at the most critical road junction in the German sector, and its crew was apparently prepared to fight to the death. Every attempt to resupply forward positions was met with accurate fire from the Soviet tank. Wounded soldiers couldn't be evacuated. Ammunition couldn't reach the front lines. The Germans tried everything they could think of. 4 50mm anti-tank guns were positioned in a battery formation and opened fire on the KV-1 from 600 meters. The armor-piercing shells bounced harmlessly off the tank's thick steel plates. After several minutes of futile bombardment, the KV-1's turret slowly traversed toward the German position and returned fire. All 4 anti-tank guns were destroyed in quick succession. The German crews were shocked. They had never encountered armor that could withstand direct hits from their best anti-tank weapons. Even worse, the Soviet tank crew demonstrated remarkable marksmanship, picking off German guns with devastating precision. Next, the Germans brought up a 105mm howitzer, hoping that high explosive shells might damage the tank, even if they couldn't penetrate its armor. But the howitzer crew couldn't hit the KV-1 from a safe distance, and every attempt to move closer was met with return fire that forced them to retreat. An 88mm anti-aircraft gun was positioned 700 meters from the crossroads, the famous 88 that could penetrate almost any armor. But as the German crews struggled to set up their weapon and acquire their target, the KV-1 spotted them first. A single well-aimed shot destroyed both the gun and its tractor before the Germans could fire. For hours, the Soviet tank crew endured a blazing summer sun inside their steel box. The temperature inside a closed tank in hot weather could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The constant German bombardment created a hellish environment of noise, heat, and concussion that would have broken most men. But the KV-1 crew held their position. They had turned their tank into an impregnable fortress, and they were prepared to die rather than give up their ground. As night fell, German engineers from Panzer Pioneer Battalion 57 attempted a desperate solution. Under cover of darkness, they crept close to the tank and placed explosive charges on its tracks and hull. The charges detonated with tremendous force, but when the smoke cleared, the KV-1 was still operational. Machine gun fire from the tank scattered the German engineers. The tank had survived everything the Germans could throw at it. Armor-piercing shells, high-explosive rounds, anti-aircraft guns, and demolition charges had all failed to stop the Soviet monster. German soldiers began to whisper that the tank was indestructible. Colonel Raus was faced with an impossible situation. His forward positions were running short of supplies. Wounded soldiers needed medical attention. The single Soviet tank was paralyzing an entire mechanized division. On the morning of June 25th, the Germans made their final desperate attempt to eliminate the lone tank. Colonel Raus assembled every available tank in his command, 50 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks from multiple companies. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Overwhelm the KV-1 with simultaneous fire from multiple directions while secretly positioning an 88mm gun for the killing shot. The coordinated attack began at dawn. German tanks advanced from 3 directions in carefully planned waves, their commanders knowing that many of them would be destroyed in the assault. The KV-1 crew, exhausted from their 40-hour vigil but still defiant, opened fire with deadly precision. The Soviet tank's 76.2mm gun spoke with authority. The first shot destroyed a Panzer IV at 800 meters. The second shot penetrated a Panzer III's frontal armor and detonated its ammunition magazine. German tanks began exploding throughout the battlefield as the KV-1 methodically engaged targets with the calm efficiency of a firing range exercise. But this time was different. While the KV-1 crew focused on the armored assault, German engineers were secretly moving an 88 mm Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun into position behind a ridgeline just 400 meters from the crossroads. The massive gun, designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers, was the only weapon in the German arsenal capable of reliably penetrating KV-1 armor. The 88-meter crew worked with desperate urgency, knowing that discovery meant certain death. They had to manhandle their 3-ton gun into position, align the sights, and load the massive shells while the battle raged just meters away. German tank crews were dying to buy them the time they needed. Finally, the 88 was ready. The gun crew, veterans of the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft units, took careful aim at the Soviet tank's side armor. At 400 meters, they couldn't miss. The first 88mm shell struck the KV-1's turret with tremendous force, creating a shower of sparks but failing to penetrate the armor. The Soviet crew, startled by the massive impact, began traversing their turret to locate this new threat. The German gun crew frantically reloaded, knowing they had only seconds before the KV-1's return fire destroyed them. The second shot hit the tank's hull, punching a small hole through the driver's compartment. The third shot penetrated the engine compartment, starting a fire that began to fill the tank with smoke. But incredibly, the KV-1 continued to fight, its main gun engaging German tanks even as flames spread through the vehicle. It took 13 direct hits from the 88mm gun to finally silence the KV-1. The massive tank, its armor shattered and its interior a furnace, finally stopped moving. Smoke poured from multiple holes in its hull, and the turret sat at an odd angle, jammed by battle damage. German soldiers approached the burning tank cautiously, their rifles ready, expecting the crew to emerge fighting to the end. They knocked experimentally on the armor, listening for signs of life inside the steel tomb. Suddenly, the turret moved. Terrified screams echoed across the battlefield as German infantry scattered, certain that the indestructible tank was about to resume firing. Someone threw a grenade through one of the holes in the armor. The explosion forced open the turret hatch. Inside the tank, the Germans found 6 bodies, 5 crew members and 1 unidentified person, possibly a political officer or passenger who had been caught in the retreat. All had died at their posts, fighting to the end against impossible odds. The German soldiers were stunned by what they discovered. The tank's interior was a hellscape of blood, metal fragments, and destroyed equipment. The crew had endured hours of bombardment in temperatures that would have killed most men. Their eardrums were certainly ruptured from the concussion of German shells. Yet they had continued to fight with deadly precision until the very end. In an unprecedented gesture, the German officers ordered that the Soviet crew be buried with full military honors. Colonel Rouse later wrote, "We were deeply shocked by this heroism. These men had fought to their last breath. The bodies were interred in a forest north of Raseiniai with a ceremony that acknowledged their extraordinary courage. In 1965, the remains were exhumed and reburied in the Soviet military cemetery in Raseiniai, where a monument honors their sacrifice." The Battle of Raseiniai continued for 3 more days, but the lone tank's sacrifice had accomplished something remarkable. For 24 critical hours, 6 Soviet tankers had stopped the advance of 5,000 German soldiers. They had forced an entire mechanized division to halt its offensive and deploy significant resources against a single target. More importantly, they had shattered German confidence. The Wehrmacht discovered that Soviet armor was far more advanced than their intelligence had suggested. The KV-1 was virtually immune to German anti-tank weapons, and Soviet tank crews were willing to fight to the death. The psychological impact rippled through German ranks. Soldiers who had considered themselves invincible were forced to confront a new reality. The Red Army had weapons and warriors that could match anything in the German arsenal. The lone KV-1 at Raseiniai became a symbol of Soviet resistance. Even as the German advance continued toward Leningrad, the story of the 6 heroes spread through Red Army units. If one tank crew could hold off an entire division, perhaps the Wehrmacht wasn't invincible after all. The tank was identified as belonging to the 3rd Company, 1st Battalion, 4th Tank Regiment of the 2nd Tank Division, but the crew's personal documents had been lost during the chaotic retreat, making individual identification impossible. They remain unknown soldiers whose names were lost to history. What isn't lost is their legacy. The KV-1 tank became the backbone of Soviet armored resistance during the darkest days of 1941. Its thick armor and powerful gun gave Red Army crews the confidence to engage German panzers on equal terms. The tank's reputation for invulnerability became a crucial factor in Soviet morale. The Germans, meanwhile, were forced to completely revise their anti-tank doctrine. The 88mm gun became standard equipment for dealing with heavy armor. German tank designers accelerated development of more powerful weapons and thicker armor, but perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Raseiniai marked the beginning of the end for German confidence in their tactical superiority. The lightning war that had conquered Europe met its match in the forests and fields of the Soviet Union. The lone KV-1 tank at the crossroads near Raseiniai proved that sometimes courage and determination matter more than numbers. 6 Soviet tankers, armed with 1 heavy tank and an unshakable resolve, had held the line against an empire. They had shown the world that the Wehrmacht could be stopped. The day when 1 tank changed the course of history.